The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stood on the deck of my dream home, gazing out over acres of untouched wilderness that stretched toward the snow-capped peaks in the distance. My name is Alex Thompson, and this 50-acre mountain property in the heart of the Rockies had been my sanctuary for the past 5 years. After selling my successful software company, I poured every penny and every ounce of passion into this land. I built a stunning modern lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the most breathtaking sunrises you could imagine, landscaped gardens that blended seamlessly with nature, and winding trails that wound through ancient forests and along crystal-clear streams. It was perfect. Peaceful. Mine. But paradise was about to be shattered by the very people who were supposed to protect property rights, the Homeowners Association. What began as a loose group of neighbors managing shared roads quickly morphed into a tyrannical board of self-appointed kings and queens, obsessed with community improvements that lined their pockets and fed their egos. They eyed my expansive land with envy, seeing dollar signs in development. One fateful morning, I noticed fresh survey stakes hammered into the lower slopes of what I knew was my private property. Then came the bulldozers, the excavators, the crews in bright vests. The HOA had secretly planned and started constructing a luxury 18-hole golf course, complete with a sprawling clubhouse, cart paths, and manicured fairways right on my deeded land. They claimed some obscure covenant or easement that didn't exist in any document I had ever signed. The arrogance was breathtaking. I watched in stunned silence as they tore through my forests, leveled my meadows, and poured concrete foundations where my wildlife used to roam freely. I had always tried to be a good neighbor, paying my dues and following rules, but this was an outrageous overreach that crossed every line. Lawyers were consulted in secret. The evidence was ironclad: surveys, deeds, aerial photos showing every inch belonged to me. Instead of rushing into a messy injunction that might drag on while they paused work, I made a calculated decision. I let them continue. I documented every truck that rolled in, every tree that fell, every fairway that was laid with their expensive imported sod. I watched as they invested tens of millions of dollars, believing they were creating an exclusive paradise for their elite members. Month after month, the golf course took shape on what was legally my mountain property, growing more elaborate and more valuable by the day. Little did they know, I was setting the stage for the ultimate takedown. This isn't just a story of property theft, it's a tale of greed versus justice, entitlement versus rights, and how one man turned the tables in the most satisfying way possible. If you love stories of underdogs winning against corrupt systems, you're in the right place. The HOA built a golf course on my mountain property, I let them finish it to perfection, and then I took them to court and won everything. But it all started years earlier when I first fell in love with this land, long before the HOA ever dared to touch it. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs every single morning for years as I stepped onto the wide cedar deck of the home I had designed and built with my own hands. This 50-acre slice of the Rockies wasn't just real estate, it was the culmination of everything I had worked for after selling my tech company at 40. I had chosen the highest ridge for its panoramic views that swept across dense pine forests, sparkling alpine streams, and distant snow-capped peaks that glowed pink at sunrise. I spent months with architects and local builders, ensuring every window framed nature perfectly and every trail I cut respected the land. Wildlife roamed freely, elk and deer, even the occasional bear, and I felt a deep peace that city life had never given me. The property was fully deeded in my name, surveyed multiple times, and paid for outright. No liens, no disputes, no shared ownership. It was mine alone. Then the neighborhood below the ridge started to grow. New homes popped up along the winding access road, and soon a small group of residents formed what they called the Mountain View Homeowners Association. At first it seemed harmless, they handled snow removal, road maintenance, and basic covenants. I paid my modest annual dues without complaint because I valued a well-kept community. But slowly the board's tone changed. Meetings I rarely attended began discussing community enhancements that sounded more like vanity projects than necessities. They floated ideas for a private lake, a tennis complex, even luxury amenities that would require funding far beyond what the small neighborhood could support. I noticed subtle pressure in their newsletters, hints that larger parcels like mine might be integrated for the greater good. I brushed it off as typical HOA overreach, the kind you hear about in viral stories online. I had my own land, my own gates, my own boundaries clearly marked on every legal document. For one crisp autumn morning everything shifted. Fresh orange survey flags appeared on the lower meadows of what I knew was my property line. Heavy equipment rumbled up the old fire road I had maintained for years. When I drove down to investigate, I found crews already staking out what looked like the beginning of fairways and greens. The HOA had not asked permission. They had not sent proper notice. They simply declared through their attorney that an old covenant, one I had never signed and that my title search had never revealed, gave them rights to develop common benefit areas. My blood ran cold as I watched the first bulldozer scrape away centuries-old soil. This was no small encroachment. The plans they later mailed me showed an entire 18-hole golf course carved directly across 30 acres of my private mountain land. The arrogance stunned me. I stood there that day, the wind whipping through the pines, realizing the peaceful life I had built was under direct assault. Yet something in me clicked. I didn't explode in rage or call the sheriff immediately. I took photos, recorded videos from every angle, and quietly hired the best real estate attorney in the state. The evidence was overwhelming. My deed was ironclad, the HOA's claimed easement was fabricated nonsense. But instead of filing an emergency injunction that might only slow them down and let them regroup, I chose patience. I let the machines keep roaring. I let the crews keep working. Because I understood one simple truth: the more they built, the more they invested, the bigger the prize when I finally took them to court. As the first fairways began to take shape and the mountain air carried the distant sound of heavy equipment day after day, I knew the real fight was only just beginning. 5 weeks turned into months as the construction on my mountain property accelerated at a pace that could only be funded by deep HOA pockets and borrowed community funds. I watched from the ridge above as crews cleared ancient stands of pine, leveled rolling meadows I had once hiked daily, and began shaping the first holes of what was becoming an undeniably impressive golf course. The roar of diesel engines echoed through the valleys every sunrise, and the once wild landscape slowly transformed under their plans. They imported premium sod that turned brown patches into vibrant green fairways, installed elaborate irrigation systems that snaked across slopes I had always left natural, and poured foundations for a grand clubhouse that would eventually overlook the very views I had paid millions to protect. Every day I documented it all: timestamps, drone footage of my own, detailed logs of materials delivered on trucks that crossed my private access road without permission. The HOA sent polite but firm letters insisting the project was for shared community benefit and that my property fell under their zoning authority. I never replied. I simply kept recording. The financial scale of their ambition became staggering. Permits were pulled using community reserves and special assessments levied on every homeowner, including me. I paid those assessments without protest, all while knowing the money was literally being poured into my land. The board members paraded around in hard hats during site visits, posing for photos that later appeared in their glossy newsletters bragging about the world-class amenity they were creating. They never once acknowledged the legal gray area they had stepped into. In their minds, my mountain property had become theirs the moment they voted on it at a closed session I wasn't invited to. I could see the entitlement in every decision: the way they rerouted streams that had flowed on my land for centuries, the way they fenced off sections that had always been mine, the way they acted as if the entire ridge now belonged to the collective. Inside, the anger burned hot, but I channeled it into strategy. I met with my attorney weekly in the city, reviewing new evidence as the golf course grew more elaborate. We calculated the exact dollar value of every tree removed, every acre altered, every improvement added. The numbers climbed into the tens of millions, and with each passing week the case against the HOA grew stronger. I walked the property lines at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of fresh-cut timber and diesel, and reminded myself that patience was the weapon. The more complete the golf course became, the harder it would be for any judge to simply order a pause or a partial teardown. They were building their own noose, acre by expensive acre. As the sun set behind the half-finished greens and the sound of hammering echoed into the night, I stood on my deck with a quiet smile. The HOA believed they were winning. They had no idea I was letting them finish what they had started on my mountain property, because when the time came, I would take it all back in court, and the victory would be sweeter than any fairway view they could ever imagine. 7 By the time the golf course reached its halfway point, the transformation of my mountain property was impossible to ignore even from the main highway miles below. What had once been wild meadows and thick forest now featured sculpted fairways winding between the pines I had left standing, pristine bunkers filled with imported white sand, and an irrigation system so advanced it could water every blade of grass from a central computer. The clubhouse foundation was poured and framed, its future deck already promising the same million-dollar views I had cherished for years. Crews worked 7 days a week, racing against the coming winter snows that would soon blanket the Rockies. The HOA board celebrated each milestone with private champagne toasts captured in their internal emails that my attorney somehow obtained. They truly believed the project was a stroke of genius, a legacy that would raise property values for everyone, especially themselves. I continued my silent vigil from the ridge, camera in hand, cataloging every violation. My attorney's team had already prepared a comprehensive dossier that included title searches proving the land was unequivocally mine, environmental impact reports showing the damage to protected wildlife corridors, and financial spreadsheets tracking every dollar the HOA had sunk into what they mistakenly called community land. The case was airtight. Still, I refused to tip my hand. When the HOA sent another demand letter threatening liens if I didn't cooperate, I filed it away without response. I paid every new assessment they levied, letting them think I had accepted defeat. Inside, the satisfaction grew. Each new green they seeded, each cart path they paved, added another zero to the eventual damages I would claim. The golf course wasn't just an illegal build anymore, it was a multi-million-dollar asset constructed entirely on my private mountain property, and every improvement belonged to me the moment the judge ruled. 8. The seasons changed around us. Autumn leaves turned gold against the manicured fairways, and the first light snow dusted the unfinished greens. The HOA pushed harder, bringing in extra crews to beat the weather. I watched their desperation mount while my own calm deepened. My attorney assured me the timing was perfect. The more complete the project, the less likely any court would order demolition. Instead, the remedy would be ownership transfer or massive compensation. I spent quiet evenings reviewing the growing file, the mountain wind whispering through the pines that still stood on the untouched upper acres. The board members grew bolder, hosting small site tours for prospective members and bragging about the exclusive golf community they were creating. They never once suspected the owner whose land they had stolen was patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the final holes neared completion and the clubhouse roof went on, the scale of their investment became breathtaking. The golf course was no longer a half-finished eyesore, it was a legitimate luxury destination nestled perfectly into the mountain landscape they had altered without permission. I stood on my deck one cold evening, the lights of the construction site glowing below, and allowed myself a single moment of pure anticipation. The HOA had built their masterpiece on my mountain property. They had poured their money, their reputation, and their arrogance into it. Now it was almost time to take it all away. The court papers were already drafted. The evidence was locked and loaded. The only thing left was to let them finish the last few touches, and then the real show would begin. 9. The day the HOA declared the golf course officially complete was one of the most surreal moments of my life. Banners fluttered across the new clubhouse, luxury carts lined up on the freshly paved paths, and the 18 holes sparkled under bright spring sunshine with perfectly manicured greens and white sand bunkers that contrasted beautifully against the dark pine forest I had once owned untouched. The board held a lavish grand opening gala, inviting every homeowner and even a few local celebrities to play the inaugural rounds. Champagne flowed, speeches praised the visionary leadership that had turned an ordinary mountain community into an exclusive golf destination, and the views from every tee box were undeniably spectacular. I received the invitation in my mailbox but never replied. Instead, I watched from my ridgetop deck as the first groups teed off on what was legally still my private mountain property. Inside the clubhouse that day, the HOA board toasted their success, completely unaware that every dollar spent, every blade of grass planted, and every structure built now strengthened my case beyond any reasonable doubt. My attorney and I had spent the final months of construction quietly perfecting the lawsuit. We had independent appraisers value the entire golf course at over $28 million, improvements made entirely on land deeded solely to me. Environmental experts documented the irreversible changes to my ecosystem. Title attorneys confirmed there was zero legal basis for the HOA's claimed rights. The file was a masterpiece of evidence, ready to be filed the moment the last piece of sod was laid. I let the grand opening happen because it created the perfect public record of their completed trespass. 10. The weeks that followed were filled with HOA self-congratulation. Newsletters bragged about membership waitlists and rising property values. Special assessments continued, and I paid everyone without a word. The golf course operated at full capacity, carts buzzing across fairways that had once been my wild meadows, golfers admiring the same mountain vistas I had protected for years. I continued my daily walks along the upper boundary, camera ready, noting every new signpost, every restricted access gate they installed on my land. The contrast was almost poetic. They celebrated their victory while I held the receipts for their destruction. My attorney filed the massive civil lawsuit the Monday after the grand opening closed. The complaint sought full ownership transfer of the golf course and surrounding land, plus damages for trespass, unjust enrichment, and willful violation of property rights. The amount claimed was enough to bankrupt the HOA several times over. The reaction was immediate and panicked. Board members scrambled, attorneys were hired on emergency retainer, and the community newsletter suddenly went silent on the golf course topic. I received the first frantic calls and letters demanding mediation, but I refused. The court date was set, and the evidence was overwhelming. As the first legal motions flew back and forth and the mountain summer brought new golfers to the course they had built on my land, I stood on my deck one evening watching the sun set over the now finished fairways. The HOA had finished their masterpiece. They had celebrated it publicly. Now the bill was coming due in court, and I was ready to collect every single cent plus the land itself. The final chapter of this saga was about to be written by a judge, and I already knew how it would end. 11 The courtroom and the county seat was packed on the first day of trial. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto polished wood benches filled with curious neighbors, anxious HOA members, and a handful of local reporters who had caught wind of the high-stakes property dispute. I sat calmly at the plaintiff's table beside my attorney, the massive binder of evidence open before us like a blueprint of the HOA's downfall. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades on the bench, listened intently as my team laid out the case in clear, methodical detail. Every survey, every deed, every photograph of construction on my mountain property was presented without emotion. The facts spoke loudly enough. The HOA's defense team squirmed, their arguments collapsing under cross-examination as they tried to invent covenants that had never existed. Expert witnesses testified to the exact value of the golf course they had built without permission, and the environmental damage that could never be undone. Week after week the trial unfolded like a slow-motion unraveling of entitlement. The HOA board members took the stand one by one, their faces pale as they admitted under oath that they had never obtained my consent, never verified the property lines, and never considered the legal consequences of their community project. Their own internal emails and meeting minutes, subpoenaed and now public, revealed the arrogance, jokes about finally getting that big lot owner to contribute and plans to force integration of my land. The judge's expression grew darker with each revelation. I never raised my voice or made a scene, I simply sat and let the evidence do the talking. Outside the courthouse, the golf course continued to operate, golfers unaware that the very land beneath their feet was the subject of a battle that would soon decide its ownership. 12 My attorney delivered the closing argument with quiet power, reminding the court that property rights are the foundation of everything we value in this country. The HOA had not merely trespassed, they had stolen, developed, and profited from land that belonged solely to me. The remedy, we argued, was simple and just: transfer full ownership of the completed golf course and the 30 acres it occupied directly to me, plus compensatory damages for the years of disruption and the illegal use of my property. The HOA's final plea for leniency fell flat. Their own documents proved they knew the risks and chose to proceed anyway. The jury, because the case had been elevated to include punitive elements, deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous and devastating for the HOA. Full ownership of the golf course and land was awarded to me. Damages exceeded $25 million, covering every improvement, every lost use, and punitive penalties for willful misconduct. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps as the judge read the ruling aloud. The HOA board sat frozen, their faces masks of disbelief. I remained composed, but inside the satisfaction was overwhelming. Years of patience, documentation, and strategic silence had paid off in the most complete victory possible. The mountain property that had always been mine was now even more valuable, complete with a luxury golf course I had never asked for but now legally owned outright. As the gavel fell and the legal teams gathered their papers, I stepped out into the bright mountain sunlight knowing the battle was over. The HOA had built their dream on my land, celebrated it, and defended it in court. Now it all belonged to me, the fairways, the clubhouse, the views, and the justice that had finally been served. 13 The weeks following the verdict brought a whirlwind of change to my mountain property that felt both surreal and deeply satisfying. Legal teams worked around the clock to execute the court order, transferring deeds and dissolving the HOA's illegal claims once and for all. The golf course, now officially mine, continued operating under temporary management while I decided its future. The same board members who had once strutted across those fairways now avoided eye contact whenever our paths crossed in town. Special assessments stopped. Community newsletters no longer mentioned the project they had once bragged about. The entire neighborhood felt the shift as word spread that one man's patience had dismantled an entire power structure built on entitlement. I stood on the clubhouse deck the first morning after the transfer was finalized, coffee in hand, looking out over the rolling fairways that glisten with morning dew under the same Rocky Mountain sun I had always loved. The views were still breathtaking, but now they belonged to me without question. I had options: keep the course as a private retreat, open it selectively, or even sell it at a profit that would dwarf my original investment in the land. The punitive damages check arrived shortly after, a sum large enough to fund whatever future I chose. Neighbors who had stayed neutral during the fight quietly congratulated me, some admitting they had always suspected the HOA had overstepped. The story spread far beyond our small mountain community. Local news ran features, property rights blogs picked it up, and the same viral channels that love HOA drama stories began sharing the tale of how one owner let them finish the golf course and then took it all in court. The HOA itself restructured under new leadership after several board members resigned in disgrace. 14 The community learned a hard lesson about overreach, and covenants were rewritten with stricter protections for individual property rights. I never gloated publicly, but I did enjoy the quiet justice of it all. My original lodge on the upper ridge remained my true home, untouched and peaceful, while the golf course below became a valuable asset that enhanced rather than threatened my sanctuary. Wildlife slowly returned to the edges of the fairways, and the streams I had once feared were ruined now flowed clearer than ever under new stewardship. As the first full season under my ownership began, golfers still came to play, unaware or unbothered by the dramatic history beneath their feet. I walked the course at dusk some evenings, the mountain air cool and the peaks glowing pink, reflecting on the long journey from that first survey stake to this moment of complete victory. The HOA had tried to take my mountain property and turn it into their legacy. I let them build it to perfection, let them celebrate it, and then let the court hand it back to its rightful owner, plus a fortune in damages. The story ended exactly as it should, with justice served, property rights upheld, and one man standing taller on the land he had always owned. The Rockies stretched endlessly before me, and for the first time in years, the view felt truly, completely mine again.